Welcome to Long Term. I'm Ty King, and this podcast that we have been creating over the past year, we've found so many different things that people need recovery in. Chances are, if you somehow found this and you're new and you're listening, it's so easy to listen to what other people have gone through and be like, man, they've got problems. And, but if we really take a look introspectively and we think about our own lives and we think about how did you grow up or things that happened in early adulthood, or maybe it's something really recent, we've all got something to recover from. And so this special series, we try to cover recovery from so many different areas and so many different angles, all the different things that people can have to recover from. Some of the big groups, some of the smaller groups. And with this series, we're focusing on how does someone recover once they decide to leave a cult? And so we all have our own definitions and ideas of what a cult is and what a person has to go through, the mental state they have to be in to even join one, but much less what do they go through whenever they have left this group where they have solidified their identity in, right? So it's so good to talk to professionals and people who have their expertise in this very area, rather than relying on my own fascination and ideas that I've had and come up with. And so it's good to test those theories and ideas against someone who actually knows what they're talking about, rather than someone who's an internal monologue. So right today we have, a very special guest. So a psychologist who is Dr. Natalie Feinblatt. I'm so excited to have you and to be talking about this with you.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem at all. So I was very grateful that you were willing to come on and, of course, specifically to talk about this. I've been kind of surprised when I, do, pitches and when I reach out and try to get guests for the show and people that are expertise in these areas, especially the psychologists, the psychiatrists. When I say, would you be willing to talk about what it's like to exit a cult? I'm kind of overwhelmed whenever someone says yes. Like, I didn't know that was going to be something that you would actually agree to talk about. Yeah, it's fantastic. So I'm going to give it to you for just a minute to talk about your specialties and your expertise. How long have you been in psychology? And yeah, I'd love to learn more about you and what you do in your everyday job.
Sure. So, I am a licensed clinical psychologist based in Los Angeles, California. And I have been working in the mental health field for over 20 years as I worked toward my doctorate and then eventually got it and got licensed and have been that for quite some time. And my two big specialties that I work with in my practice are people who need to recover from addictions and from trauma. And that initially came about because I was working in addiction when I was getting my training in the field. And I think most people who work in addiction would agree that you can't really specialize in addiction recovery for very long without also becoming a trauma specialist because the Venn diagrams of those two populations overlap so heavily. But that being said, always it has something that it was an interest of mine since before I even got into this field were cults, and I know a lot of people find them very interesting. And so I've been fortunate enough through the course of my career. I wrote my dissertation on, using therapy to help people recover from cult involvement. That I've been able to kind of specialize in what I kind of view as like I work with the broader trauma umbrella, and there's a lot of things that can fall under there. And one of those things is cult recovery. And so I've been the first half of my career, I mostly worked in like treatment centers, so I didn't really have a way to kind of specifically work with folks who have been in cults. But this past decade, since I've been in private practice, that has been something I've been able to do. And at any given time, I've got multiple clients in my practice who fall into that category, and who I am trying to help them recover from what they've been through.
Really, it's what's common enough. I know it's not super common, but it's common enough to where you have multiple clients at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, probably being in Los Angeles There's a decent number of groups that have a foothold out here. So, maybe more so than, in the middle of the country. But yeah, I mean, I don't build my entire practice on it, but it is definitely, one of the parts of my practice at any given time. And when I first started specializing in this, and I became aware of the people who already existed that specialized in this, there's definitely people who do this, but it's not a huge amount. And something that I've been happy to see over the last 5 to 10 years is that seems to be growing. More and more people seem to be specializing in this, whether it's through like, religious deconstruction is often what it's called, or things around those lines. Recovering from spiritual abuse. But it is a small field, but a growing field. So I'm glad it's growing because I think there are definitely folks out there who need this.
Yeah, it seems like there's a big need for that resource to be available to them. I mean, just like in recovery, once people were starting to regular or, make that something that was acceptable in society, I guess, like, oh, you can get away from, you can, be an addict for so long and then you can figure out a new way to live where you're not, giving in to that addiction. Yeah, the same thing here. Have you found, since you've treated both, it's fascinating to me. Have you seen anything that is a commonality, like a common ground between treating somebody who, maybe suffers from substance use addiction versus someone who's exiting a cult?
Yes, definitely. This is something where some strong parallels have popped up over the years. One is it's very similar in regard to the fact that you can't make somebody get sober and you can't make somebody leave a cult or a group before they are ready to do so, right? Like, and oftentimes the more heavy-handed you are in trying to extract them from the situation, the more they're gonna kind of go in the opposite direction and just dig their heels in deeper, right? So that's a big one, is that whether it's addiction or a cult, you can't force anybody to do anything. And you also, they're not going to be done until they are internally ready to be done with it.
Hmm.
And another thing that I see that is a commonality is how much of a negative impact it can have on the people that are close to them. Um, you know, very similarly to kind of like how the problems that Al-Anons develop around, wanting to control and try to help and try to, cajole the person into doing things differently. Similar sort of things happen in cults where people see their loved one in this bad situation and they really want to get them out, and they're just kind of super fixated on it, and it's like taking up all of their time and energy, when the reality is all you can really do kind of in both cases is to let the loved one know, like, I'm here, I will always be here, and when you are ready to maybe stop doing what you're doing, I'm going to be here to support you, and you just let me know when that happens, right? And the loved ones of people in cults often need that same higher level of support that loved ones of those in active addiction do.
Yeah. It seems like, once you've rooted yourself, like your identity is with a group, right? Once you join one of these groups, your self worth, I mean, everything is tied to it, your social identity. And most of the time, they're led by a charismatic leader that, expects absolute fealty to to them. And so that get also your identity is tied to that. How loyal am I to the leader? But once they break away, it seems like it would be difficult after, especially if you've been with a group for years, months, or how, depending how intense it was, and how integrated you were into it. It seems to me like it would be hard to decipher what is reality and what is not. Is that something you've crossed?
Definitely. And it really depends. I mean, there's always going to be a level of that because that's just how it goes when you've been in a situation that has been trying to manipulate you, control you, do whatever they can to have power over you. But it also depends in terms of like how, I don't know the best way to say this, but like how far out, quote unquote, the beliefs or
Mm.
practices of the group were, right? Because in some groups, people are being told things that are entirely fictional,
Yeah.
completely impossible, and they're, being, manipulated into believing these things. And so coming out into the quote unquote real world, it can be very disconcerting to start trying to peel apart like, okay, what parts of this fantastical stuff may be accurate and what's entirely made up? How does it change how I interact with the world and the people around me or the things that I do in my own personal life? And it can be, there is oftentimes a lot of gaslighting involved in cults.
Mm.
And that's, making people question their own sanity or their ability to perceive reality correctly. And so that's not something you can just flip off like a switch, right? Like if you've been gaslit for years and ultimately taught to kind of gaslit yourself, just because you leave doesn't mean it's going to be easy for you to all of a sudden trust that you can trust your perceptions,
Hmm.
right? It's going to be a process of getting there, and it can be done, but it might take a while.
Yeah. And for people that fall into substance use and they start their addiction, usually, like you said, you start off in treating addiction, but you end up treating them for some sort of trauma, which is usually a root cause, of why they were so quick to, accept or, get into that lifestyle. Is it
Definitely
the
can.
same for when a person joins one of these, sort of groups that are cult like, I guess?
Um, I'd say it is similar. Yes, it's similar and different. And what I'll say about that is, there is definitely many, many, many times when someone is struggling with an addiction, there are underlying, often, life conditions or psychological problems that they were trying to self-medicate with whatever the behavior was. And once you get sober, then you have to go back and be like, okay, well, here's this issue that I've been medicating for. Now I need to also deal with this. And I would say that there are definitely people who get wrapped up in cult-like situations, as at least initially as a way to maybe escape problems in their life or fix problems in their life. But I would also, so that's how it's similar, I think. And then, once you leave, you still have to kind of deal with those problems that maybe got you into the cult in the first place that you were trying to address. But another thing I will say that I think makes it a little bit different is that cults prey on vulnerable people, and they prey on people who, generally speaking, are in some sort of transition in their life, whether it's like a loss, like, losing a loved one or a job or a divorce, or it can even be, positive transitions like going away to college or moving to a different country or whatever it is. And I think that in those situations, that's just a, abusive party taking advantage of someone who's in a vulnerable position, not necessarily like someone who's got problems looking to, you know, try to fix them or get help for them in some way. So yeah, I'd say there's some similarities, but also some differences there.
Yeah. What are some of the first steps that we need to know about, in treating somebody that's coming out of a cult? Do they come to you sort of early on, or does it take a while for them to even accept that they may need some therapy?
I get people all through the spectrum. I the earliest stages of the spectrum would be a loved one reaching out to me about someone who is in a cult that they are worried about. And I am not, and I know that this is not the case for everyone who does this work, but I am not in the business of trying to do therapy with people who aren't yet wanting to do that. Um, I'm not like I don't help extract people from groups, unless that's what they are wanting to do themselves. So the earliest I will work with someone is someone who is like fresh out of a cult and is just kind of in shock and just trying to figure out their day-to-day life, and that, but I also work with people who are, down the line, people who maybe have been out for a long time but never really processed what they've been went through, or have, come across barriers to just living a healthy life along the way somewhere. So I work with people that are kind of all on the spectrum, because another similarity to addiction recovery is that, like, people have different needs at different points in the process, right? Like, when you're first out, it's usually just kind of like your life has just changed dramatically, and maybe you don't have any idea how to deal with that except to either stay sober or not go back to the group. Whereas down the line, you might have kind of more quote unquote mature problems, like, okay, I've got a life established. I've got, roof over my head, a job, like I'm starting to make, friends or whatever it is, but like I kind of am not sure what the meaning of my life is anymore, and like kind of who I am and what I want it to become. So what people need can definitely depend on what stage they're at in that leaving to healing process.
What are some of the deeper things that people need to address whenever they are, whenever they do exit the cult and then they're back into maybe they were separated from their family, when they were in that group. They were definitely separated from society in the most part.
Usually, yeah.
Yeah. What are some of the main things that they need to address just to live their day-to-day lives?
Well, I think there's two levels. I think there's that immediate level of, people often come out of cults financially decimated, um, possibly without any work experience or skills, or a huge gap in their resume, possibly, needing to reconnect with people that they have been separated from for a very long time. So I think the needs at first can often be like food, shelter, clothing, the most basic stuff. If they've come out of the situation with nothing or next to nothing. Um, but what I would say beyond that, kind of the second level of that, would be the fact that everybody who has been in a cult has been abused or traumatized in some way.
Mm.
Exactly how depends on the cult. Because at the very least, and that's not to say that it's not important, but it is, it's the foundation of it. But at the very least, they have been working under a system of coercive control, right? Which is psychological abuse, manipulation, control of people, right? And that in and of itself is traumatic and needs unpacking and healing from, right? Then potentially on top of that, there may have been physical abuse, there may have been sexual abuse, there may have been, types of financial abuse, and those obviously are also very important, and need their own unpacking and healing from.
How is whenever somebody is in those situations and they come out and maybe they're a parent, is it easy to go back into parenthood? Yeah, I've recently been watching, just studying on up on this, of like, okay, I need to refresh and like what was real, what was not, over the years of just hearing about cults and stuff. But um so we in Arkansas, in Northwest Arkansas, we had, the Second Davidians and there was the Tony Alamo. But with them, some of there was a couple of dads that up and left the group, but they still had children that were there, and then rather than allowing them to get the children, they ended up shipping the children to a different compound in California, and so it was a separation. I don't know if that's a common thing, but if I guess twofold is the question. If that's a thing, how do they deal with their child still being part of that cult? And if not, how do they go back to being a parent on the outside of that?
Oh, yeah, that can be really hard. It definitely happens in a lot of groups. Um, when there's a situation where there is a family where there are parents who have children, and one of the parents decides to leave and the other one is going to stay, cults are all about power and control, right? And they use their members however they can, as a form of that power and control. And so I think most cults would see those children that are still in as number one, assets. Like they are people that, if they stay, can be controlled and, used to achieve whatever ends the group is trying to work toward. So I have seen it happen very similar to the thing that you just explained, where cults will go to great lengths to make sure that that parent that got out does not see those kids. And I've worked with people in both positions where they were like the fathers in that example, where they had zero access to their kids for however long, or situations where maybe the kids were still with the other parent who was in and they were technically still in the cult, but the parent who got out still had, some degree of, contact with their kids and ability to parent them. um, and boy, that can be a tricky, tricky situation. For the one who has no contact with their kids, there's a lot of grief and loss around that. There's a lot of anxiety about, because, this person who left, they left for a reason. They saw the truth about the group. They know their kids are in some sort of danger, right? And being able to do nothing about that can be just so, so very hard to sit with. Whereas the ones who still have access to their kids or some ability to parent, it's a delicate dance because, they kind of walk a tightrope of like, I want to love my kids, I want to parent my kids, I want to protect my kids, but I also know that if I say anything that might even be slightly critical of the group, I run the risk of losing the access that I have to these kids. Um, so it's really tricky either.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a, a lot to be considered, and I can't even imagine being put into those, those shoes and try to fulfill that place. And all of a sudden, you got all these other roles that you need to fill. When maybe before your one role was to serve whoever this person was, and maybe they assigned you something. Um, so the role of the psychologist, I mean, that's plain and clear. That's something you probably need is therapy. Um, are there
Yes.
anything else? Is there anything else that we have that's a resource that's available that or that's necessary or that is helping in some way, form, or fashion of someone that leaves a cult?
Yes. There are multiple organizations that are really helpful. The first one that I always recommend people to is the International Cultic Studies Association, or ICSA. They are one of the bigger groups. They are, as the name says, international, but they're based here in the United States, but they have people all over the world. They run support groups and, have really helpful resources for people who are trying to come out of this. There are some other similar organizations in the United States, that do kind of the same thing. And then for certain cults, there are actually organizations that are specific, like, don't know if you're aware, but for people who leave Scientology, there is the Aftermath Foundation. Yeah, they specifically help people who have left Scientology kind of get their bearings in terms of like hooking them up with housing or, work, or getting them some therapy or whatever it is. I believe there are similar organizations for people who have left the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormon Church, and things like that. So I think, luckily, in the day and age of the internet is both a wonderful and terrible thing. But one of the wonderful things about it is, if somebody was just to Google, like, help leaving a cult or help leaving Scientology, like, these organizations would pop up on that first page. And they would be good options to reach out to.
Wow. What do you wish that the general public understood better about cults and the impact that it has?
Yeah. There's a few things. So one, and this is kind of this one's been around for a long time, which is that the general public seems to think that people who quote unquote fall for cults are like gullible, stupid, heaven forbid, right? Like any of the naive, whatever it is, right? And that is just not true. As I mentioned earlier, really the only commonality amongst people who join cults are people who have been through some sort of transition in their life, right? Where it was like wrong place, wrong time, right? Like your parent just died and you got approached by somebody from this church or this group and you were feeling desperate and sad and you were like, okay, I guess I'll hear him out. And one thing led to another or whatever. And the reason that that's important is, I mean, a couple of reasons. One is that means that the reality is that at certain points in our life, we are all vulnerable to getting wrapped up in something like this, right? Like find somebody with a life where they've had no loss or transitions, right? Like not possible. So it's just a matter of like wrong place, wrong time for any of us. And then number two, it's also important to know that's not true because it's really insulting to people who have been in these situations for folks to have that opinion. And like, I got to tell you, majority of people I've worked with who've been in cults are some of the smartest, nicest people you will ever meet, and so it's definitely not the case that there's some flaw that creates people who are, more easily, go into a cult. Um, and I guess the other thing that comes to mind in terms of public perception is that we need to do a lot of work. Um, we need to do a lot of work on the public perception around number one, coercive control, because people think that like if you weren't being physically or sexually abused, you were just going along with it out of your own free will, which is just not how coercive control works. And number two, alongside that the 4F trauma responses, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, right? Like when people will say, well, why did you stay there, or why did you go along with it, right? That is absent of an understanding that some people respond to trauma by freezing, right? Some people respond to trauma by, fawning or just being nice to whoever's hurting them in an effort to make it stop, right? And so when we say things like, oh, you stuck around or you just did what they told you, we need to do a better job of educating people that all of us have these trauma responses hardwired in our nervous system. And nobody who is being abused is just going along with it because they want to, right? It's because their nervous system is trying to help them survive, not because they like what's happening or they change their mind later or something.
Yeah, it's helpful. Thank you. This is more of a generalized question, but it can be specific towards, basically anything. What should people look for in a therapist when they are considering therapy?
Excellent question. Because I talk about this a lot with folks, not just about the cult recovery, but in anything in general. So there's another misconception that um, you can see any therapist for any issue. I mean, technically, I guess you can, but you should not, because just like in medicine and in many other fields, different therapists specialize in different problems, right? And so when you are looking for a therapist specifically because you've been in a cult and you need help healing from that, you need to be number one, at the very least, looking for a trauma specialist, right? Because again, not all therapists specialize in trauma, right? Like they just don't. There's plenty of people out there that don't touch trauma. The same way there's people out there that don't touch addiction or eating disorders or anything else, right? So number one, you need to make sure at the very least they are a trauma specialist. And then ideally also seeing if you can find someone who has experience in helping people recover from cults or religious abuse. And I've actually, I can share this with you. I don't know if this would be something that you could pass on to your audience in some way. But a year or two ago, I made a video where I essentially taught people how to find a therapist that has cult experience. And it's how to find that if you can pay out of pocket, if you need insurance coverage, or if you can't really pay very much. So I'd be happy to, share that if it would be helpful. But
Absolutely.
um, ideally, finding somebody with expertise in this area would be the best. And like I said earlier, it has been growing over the last 5 to 10 years, and I'm hoping that continues. So where there, yeah, it's not the biggest group of folks. It's not like therapists who specialize in anxiety, like that's a huge.
Mhm.
um, but I think as time marches on, there will be more and more options for people, thankfully.
Absolutely. Well, Natalie, you've given us so much to think about today, and I really appreciate you being willing to share your expertise and to come on here and answer some questions for us. So, if somebody wanted to find out more about your practice, is there anywhere that they can go for that?
Absolutely. So they can go on my website, which is drnataliefeinblatt.com. Um, or if it's easier to spell, on Instagram and on TikTok, I'm at Healing with Dr. Natalie. So any of those will take you to places where you can find more info about what I do and who I work with and everything.
Okay, great. We'll put links to both of those in the show notes of this podcast. And Dr. Feinblatt, thank you so much again for taking the time and for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And if, thank you for listening. If you are watching this on YouTube, you can find us as an audio podcast on all the audio podcast platforms from iHeart to Apple Podcast and YouTube Music. There are like 20 of them, and you can find us wherever you listen to your podcast. Vice versa, if you're listening to this as an audio podcast, you can find us on YouTube. Search for podcast. I'm saying that 20 million times. Search for Long Term, a podcast in recovery, and it will pop up, and you'll be able to see this. You'll be able to see Dr. Feinblatt here. And if you heard something here that was said, the biggest way to help us grow this message and to grow the show is to share this message with the people that need to hear it, right? If you heard Dr. Feinblatt say something here, you're like, that's really interesting, or I know exactly who needs to hear that, share this episode with them. And the worst thing that can happen is that they don't listen to it. The best thing that can happen is that it can change a life. And so, with that, I appreciate you. Thank you so much for spending your time here, and we will see you in the next episode. All right. I'm going to hit stop.